Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Tuesday afternoon's tutorial. So tonight's tutorial, or this afternoon's tutorial, is all about composition, and we'll be looking at one of the past, I can't remember if it's a past practical or a past paper, but it's a problem that was given in the past, and we're just going to run through it. It is quite extensive in terms of information that's being provided, but you'll see that's not necessarily a bad thing. Now, one thing I do want to point out is there is a function in here, a built-in function that we will be using, but this function is only used if we tell you to use it. There's not really another reason to use it, essentially, but you'll see that when we get to that. So let's run through the entire thing first, and then after that, we'll see what we get. So I'm going to read through everything first so that you guys have an idea of what we're looking at. And then after that, we'll break it down, do the UML design, because we're going to need that, and then we'll code out the implementation. All right. So it is an unwritten rule of nature that one must toil away during the summertime to ensure that they have enough supplies during the wintertime. Unfortunately, Dennis Grasshopper has been a bit of a slacker, lazying about in the sun, living life very well. With winter around the corner, he now realizes that he has left his food carrying a little too late and has decided to crash at a warm, cozy ant colony instead. So your application or the application that we'll be doing together is going to help him. So even if you don't really want to help the bad slacker guy here, you've decided that there are so many ant colonies out there, you're going to help him figure out which one is the hardest working one, and he's going to crash there. So to begin with, we begin by creating a class called cAnt, which has the following attributes. So we've got the worker ID, a unique integer value, assigned to the worker ant at instantiation. Now keep in mind, this is for the worker ant only. They are identified by values 100 and greater. Ants do not have names, and so this ID cannot be changed afterwards. So once this ID is set, it cannot be changed. What does that mean? If I tell you it cannot be changed after it's been set, what does that essentially tell you? It's a read-only, yes. So ants do not have names, so therefore it cannot change afterwards. Then we've got the weight. The weight of the ant. We've got the hard worker level, so how hard the ant works, 1 to 10. 10 being a value that makes slave drivers happy. It also has the following variables. So it has this ID record, an integer value that starts at 99. It is used to keep track of what the next number sequence should be. It is used to allocate worker IDs for cAnt objects. It cannot be read nor changed directly. What does that tell you? Shared and what else? What else does that tell you? Is there going to be a property method for them? It cannot be read nor changed directly, which means there's not going to be a property method for this specific instance variable at all. Wrong screen. Which screen? The screen. Right. In addition to the necessary properties and utility, another term for a helper method for the above attributes and instance variables The cAnd class also has a number of methods that must be implemented. So the first method is determine work ethic, returns the ant's hard work level divided by a random value between 1 and 10. Now the method I'm going to show you, the built-in function, is going to be the random function. We have our second method, so the gather food returns the amount of food units gathered by the ant. Ants are able to carry 7 times their weight. The amount of food they gather is determined by how much they can carry, multiplied by their work ethic. So the given formula for these functions, you've got a constructor that will set the worker ID, weight, and worker level or hard worker level at instantiation. The corresponding instance variable of the hard worker level property must be initialized to 0, and the instance variable of worker ID must be -1 if no worker ID is provided as argument. So in the parameter list, if a worker ID is not provided, then the worker ID is set to -1, and the hard worker level is initialized to 0 when instantiation is, or when the instantiation takes place. So the next ID, a class level, not object level function that increments, returns the value of _ID record by 1, so that the next time it is called, it will return the next number in the sequence. If I call it now, it should return 100. The second time I call it, it should return 101, and so on and so forth. So you can see that it will continuously increase. So it kind of gives us a unique value for each ant that we instantiate, ensuring that the value is not duplicated, essentially. All right. And keep in mind, this is a class level, not object level function. Is this a function that you want to use outside the class? If I just put my phone on silent here or on mute. Is this something you want to use outside the class? I'll leave that for you to do before we get to the code. So think about it. As we code it out, even still think about it. So a hint, a constructor must be used to initialize the value of _ID record. Oh, and there it gave it away. Ah, the fun. All right. Once the cAnd class has been developed, create a second class called cColony with the following instance variables. So you've got colony name, number of ants, work hours, days in operation, and food reserve. So there's a short description for each one of them. The colony name is a read-only option, or is a read-only property, which means that it can only be read, can't be changed. An integer representing the number of ants in the colony. For the number of ants array, an array representing the various ants that are part of the colony. I wonder, am I giving away the answer for the bonus question in tonight's TOT? Maybe. So, work hours, an integer value that represents the number of work hours that ants work for each day. Days in operation, and then food reserve. So we will come back to that in a moment. In addition to the property and utility methods for the above attributes, the cColony class also has the following methods. So there's a new, so you know this is now the constructor. This is new colony, colony name, number of ants, number of days, work hours. Sets the colony name, number of ants in the colony, the number of days that the ant colony has been operating, as well as the number of work hours that the ants work for each day. All cAnts objects must be instantiated within the constructor using the generate_ant function. So there's a generate_ant function that we'll need to create as well. Then we've got generate weight, returns a random integer value between 1 and 15. This function is used to generate random weights for each cAnt object. We've got generate hard worker level, returns a random integer value to determine how hard a CAnt object should work. You've got generate worker chance, returns a Boolean value of true if a randomly generated value between 1 and 100 is divisible by 10, otherwise returns false. Generate ant randomly generates and returns a CAnt object. New CAnt objects have a 1 in 10 chance that it is not a worker ant. If it is decided that a CAnt object should be a worker ant, it must obtain a worker ID, otherwise the worker ID must be a null value. Make use of the above 3 generators functions to automatically generate values for the instantiation of the CAnt object. So if that confuses you for a moment, don't worry about it. We'll still get to that and extract it a bit better. Then you've got crack whip, invokes the gather food function of CAnt. I know it's a lot to take in. We're going to focus more on the design and the composition here than the actual coding of everything. But we'll try and see if we can finish with everything before the end of the night. But the composition is the important part here. Everything here, it's quite a lot, and it's there for you to go and practice this at as well. It's not for me to code everything out for you. But we're going to talk through it and see where we get. So crack whip invokes the gather food function of each CAnt object for the number of days that the colony has been in operation, taking into consideration the CAnt objects gather food every work hour. Objects gather food every work hour each day. The workers, the results are added to this food reserves variable, returns a multi-line string that describes each gather food invocation as follows. So if an ant is not a worker ant is not a worker ant and does nothing. So that would be returned for an ant that is not a worker ant, and the return for an ant that is a worker ant, it would be ant the worker ID brings back value returned by gather food units of food. So basically, for each ant in that colony or in that colony, you'll return a multi-string value that will represent whether they collected food or whether they have not collected food, in terms of if they're a worker or not. Then we've got gather, returns a string detailing the activities at the colony. So colony name, value of the colony name, number of ants, value of number of ants, work hours, days in operation, gather efforts, and food reserves. So it tells you what values display in this gather statement. Then your form must then allow Dennis Grasshopper to specify the number of ant colonies as well as the necessary information for each ant colony. The program must use a multi-line text box to display all the results of invoking gather from each ant colony. Finally, it must display in a different text box the name of the ant colony that has the most food, the highest food reserve or reserves level. All right. So that is the, I want to say intro, but I guess it's a bit more of an intro to the problem. It is quite a lot to take in at first glance. I do recommend that each one of you go and try and code this out completely from start to finish. Everything in place, all the functions in place, and the functions working. And if you want me to check it, I'll check it for you. But what we're going to do now is we're first going to start off with the design. So let's start our UML design. And then we look at the information that is needed. So let's start off with the CAnt colony. Sorry, I'm just waiting for, there's an application that I use to draw my diagrams. So just waiting for it to start, which seems like it does not want to start. Okay, fine. Let's do this in PowerPoint maybe. Or in Word. We'll do it in Word. So let's just insert our table. Start with our cAnt. And the first thing we need to do is we need to create our instance of variables. We've got private underscore worker ID. Let's just change something here quickly. Okay, so we've got underscore worker ID. It will be an integer. You've got your hard worker level. Will also be an integer. And you have your weight. Because I should have done weight secondly. And in this case, it will also be an integer. Now, it doesn't really matter if you make it an integer or a double, but because our random function is returning a value between 1 and 5, let's get back to that function. Here we go. So because our generate weight function returns an integer value between 1 and 5, we know that the weight is going to be an integer. So that is how I know weight in this case is going to be an integer. And then we have our record, ID record, which I just typed somewhere else. Which is also an integer. And this is shared. We need to indicate that it is shared. Then we look at our constructors. So when we look at this, so we'll get to the functions in a moment. We've got our constructor over here that describes two constructors essentially. One, where we instantiate the worker ID, the weight, and the hard worker, and another where if worker ID is not provided, we must make it -1, as well as initialize hard worker level to 0. In this case, is hard worker level a provided value? Is it a value that we'll be giving the program? And if I say giving the program, I meant, is it a value that we need to give to the constructor? Or is it a value that will work itself out? So work itself out. So we have a function, return a random integer value to determine how hard a cAnt object should work. And then it says cAnt for details. So this value is not part of the generator or the constructor, because the constructor itself tells us that we need to initialize our hard worker level to 0. But the hard worker level is also determined in a function later on, which is generate worker chance. No, generate hard worker level. So if you look at it, do we need a constructor that will accept the hard worker level? Or is that reference to when the worker level is -1? The worker ID is -1. So while you guys think about that, I'm going to start typing out our first constructor, which we know requires our worker ID. So the question is, for our second constructor, do we need hard worker level as a parameter? And even for our first constructor, would we need it there? I'll resize this in a moment. Okay, so let's see. So we don't need it for the second one. So what do we need for our second constructor? Just the way. Because if the worker ID is not given, the only thing that is required is the weight. Right. Those are the only two constructors that we need. Do we need any other constructors? So I've got one person saying no. Anyone else that disagrees with that? So okay, so another person saying no. Why not? Why can't I have another constructor? What's wrong with having another constructor? Because we have the 3 parameters, and because we've dealt with everything that is required. We weren't given anything else that is required. Always consider what is required. Always consider, do I need to do something else with this class that I have not done yet or implemented yet? Or is everything there? I know that's probably a weird way of stating it, but essentially you just need to consider how you're going to create these objects. And prefer you would create the objects using your constructor, so you've handled every variation possible currently in the program. Well, that should be in the program. But we said that should be in the program because you need to do your design before you do your implementation. Right. The property methods, we've got our 3 private property methods for our instance variables at the top, and our worker being a read-only property method because you don't want them to change it. We have our methods. Now, you can tell me something about work ethic. What do you notice about work ethic? What do you guys see about work ethic? What's going on there? Divided by a random number? No, that's not it. We're talking about the definition now. Yes, it's private. Why is work ethic private? Can't be used outside the class. That is correct. It will only be used inside the class. So a different way of looking at this, is essentially that the class itself is going to use it, the utility method, but the idea here is the class itself is going to use it. Nothing outside the class is going to use it. One way for me to maybe describe this is, let's look at you as a person. Do you breathe automatically, or do you have to tell yourself to breathe? It's done automatically. It's done. It's well, I guess for most people it's done automatically. Some people need to be reminded to breathe. But the idea here is the fact that it's done within itself. Nothing outside of your body tells you to breathe. Your body tells itself to breathe. Same with the class. The determine worth ethic is a utility method inside the class that's only used inside the class. Nothing calls it from outside the class. If that makes sense to you, I hope that kind of makes sense to you. I guess there's various ways of explaining it, but essentially is you're just using it inside the class. Nothing outside the class uses it. How would you spot that, sir? I fear that question. Do you mean how would you spot someone that needs to breathe, or how would you spot that it's only going to be used inside the class or outside the class? How do you spot that it's a private? Okay, so the one thing you'll see when you go through your definitions, especially when you're defining the, so let's say you make this public to start off with. Is that wrong? Why? What makes it wrong? It can still be used inside the class. It just means an external class can call it as well now. But why is it wrong? If you look at determine work ethic, returns the ant's hard worker level divided by a random value between 1 and 10. That's all it does. It just returns the work ethic. So it returns a value for the work ethic. Why is it wrong if this is public? If you look at generate hard worker level, returns a random integer value to determine how hard a cant object should work. See cant for details. So you're looking at a generator that already determines that value. But how is it going to be called? How is it going to be used? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it public for now. We'll get back to this. Because I want you to think about it. If you have something as private or something as public, when is it right and when is it wrong? All right. So the next thing we want to do is see colony before I run out of time like last week. It might confuse you right now because we're still in the design phase, but keep in mind that just because the design says it's one thing doesn't always mean it's going to remain like that. The design is kind of a suggestion what you should have. You can change it afterwards. Most of the time, your design is going to change because you'll see, okay, I maybe made a mistake, or I forgot to add something, or I have something too much, too many instance variables, or too many variables. Your design is never going to be your full implementation. There's always going to be something potentially that's either going to add, change, or be removed. What was this? This was an integer. Bad habit of auto spacing. Work hours. Sorry, I'm basically just copying what's on the right side of the screen. You should be able to see what's on the right side of the screen. Creating the colonies. Making the spelling errors. You involve the word is right there, right next to me. Right, there's an operation and then food reserves for our last one. That is also an integer. So let's look at our methods. We need a constructor here. You guys suddenly vanished. Do we need a constructor here? Guys? Can you still hear me? Ah, yes. Okay, there we go. Now, how many constructors do we need here? One, because it tells us which one we need. So it tells us exactly what constructor to create. So we've got our C colony. That is correct with our 4 parameters. I'm going to do a Larry Tesla here. Speed things along. We've got the colony name. We've got the number of ants. The number of days. and then the worker hours, or work hours. Expand this. Right. Then we have our property methods. So our property methods, each for our instance variables. Make things a bit easier for us here. Your index. Okay, and then we have one read only. Yeah, so we've got our property methods there. Using some quick magic to get them there. Now we can look at our methods. This is probably where most of you, if you read through the thing, you'll probably see, okay, this is where I'm slightly getting confused of what information is really going on here. So for each one of these ants that are generated, the colony is basically going to auto-generate them for us. So you've got generate weights, generate worker, or generate hard worker level, generate worker chance, generate ant. We've got crack the whip, we've got gather food, and then we've got gather. So all of these are methods that we need inside our colony. Back on the question that was, okay, resolve on. Back on the question that was confusing, the determined work ethic is private because it's specified that it returns the instance variable hard worker level, and this is found inside the class only. That's my reason, sir. Okay. We'll see if you're correct in a moment. So all of them are methods, yes. So the 4 generates you'll see on the screen at the moment. So the generate weight, generate hard worker level, generate worker chance, generate and crack, whip, gather food, and then gather are all methods. Now, this is probably going to make a bit more sense to you. Just lost my spot. Generate weight. Return integer. We've got generate hard worker level. These are private as well. You can tell me why this time. This one will probably make more sense. Or it's easier to spot. The C result added to the C if you return a multi-line string. Okay, so if you look at CrackWeb, invokes the gather food function of each sea ant object for the number of days that the colony has been in operation, taking into consideration that sea ant object gather food every work hour each day. The results are added to this underscore food reserves variable, returns a multi-line string that describes each gather food invocation as follows. So, what is our return item here? It would be a string. No, I know. And gather food invocation as follows, and then gives you a indication essentially. Also returns a string. If you look at it, the invocation of gather food will either give you and is not working and does nothing, or brings back and worker ID brings back value returned by gather food units of food. And that is the gather food that we have inside our worker. So the question is, let's just see, because they've got to do with the details. Okay, no, that's the question. Right. So if you look at it, gather food in the colony has a return. So returns a multi-value. So if your CrackWeb invokes gather food function of each sea ant object for the number of days that the colony has been in operation. Taking into consideration the sea ant objects gather food every work hour each day. The results are added to the underscore food reserves variable, returns a multi-value string that describes each gather food invocation as follows. No, so that does not return, sorry, my mistake, that does not return a value, because what that does, it adds the food to the food reserves, but the CrackWeb returns a multi-string value to determine what the return was, or basically to determine how active the ants of the colony were. So let's say you've got 3 ants, 2 of them are worker ants and 1 ant is not a worker ant. Then you'll have 1 return saying ant is not a worker ant and does nothing, and then 2 returns with ant, and the ant ID brings back, and then the value of unit of food that unit or that ant brought back. So sorry, gather food does not return anything, it's void. Gather food inside the colony just changes or adds to the underscore food reserves. No. So gather food inside the colony is void, because the gather food invokes the gather food inside the sea ant. Essentially, gather food doesn't actually need to even be here, because if you look at it, invokes gather food function of each sea ant. So with other words, it calls the gather function inside sea ant. It doesn't mean there is a function out here, but we're going to code it up. I don't want to confuse you now, so I'm going to just leave it there. But if you think about it, it says invokes the gather food function of each sea ant, and each sea ant has a gather food there. Now, if it doesn't return anything, you can already see that it's not a worker ant. So with other words, you're only going to invoke that call if worker and, because you don't want to waste those resources. So you're going to check beforehand, is it a worker and? If not, then it's a lazy bum. And if it is a worker and, you invoke the gather food function, which returns the value of food that specific ant gathered. That is correct. So in this case, gather food is not actually a function inside the colony. It just invokes the function inside the C ant. But each return, where is this now? My mouse. Each return adds, so the results are added to the underscore food reserves variable. So there's two ways of doing this. One way of doing this is you can either invoke gather food for each C ant, and then inside crack whip allocate those resources for food reserves, or you can add a void gather food function that will call the gather food for each ant, change the variable, but the crack the whip determines the multi-value string of what the return of that value is and whether it is a worker ant or not. Now, if you're slightly confused by that, don't worry. We're going to code it out. So once we code it out, you'll understand a bit better what I'm referring to, because there's two ways you can do it. One, you just do the same features, but within the one function call or within the one method. And the other way of doing it is having two methods, one dedicated to changing the value, and then one dedicated to determining the output. All right. And then we've got our gather, which returns the output you can see on the screen. All right. So this is composition. So you need to make sure that you have the arrows. I'm making a mistake here. You need to make sure that you include the arrows here. Of the diamond figure. Was there a composition arrow? No, not in this case. So we've got our line. A bit of waiting. We've got our diamond. Use the thickness there. There we go. So we've got our composition, showing us that we've got an instance of C ant inside C colony. So can you please re-explain the constructor for C ant? Right. So for C ant, we've got two constructors. The reason why we have two constructors is because, as the program describes it, or the description describes it, you've got, where is this now? You've got one constructor, a constructor that will set the worker ID, weight, and the hard worker at instantiation. So there will be one constructor that sets all three of those values. Then the corresponding instant variable of the hard worker ID property must be instantiated to 0, and the instance variable of worker ID must be -1 if no worker ID is provided as argument. So in other words, if you don't provide the worker ID as an argument, which means there's one parameter less, you're only going to have, or you're going to make worker ID -1 and then instantiate your hard worker level to 0. Why do I need to instantiate my hard worker level to 0 and my worker ID to -1? What's the reason for that? You can tell me. Why do we want to make the worker ant ID? Oh, sorry, the every other ant other than the worker ant. Why do we want to make the ID -1? You can tell me that. What's the reason for that? Where's my mouse? So that those ants aren't included? They're still created. They're still inside our function. Because lazy grasshopper isn't counted? No. If we look at our requirement, crack whip. So you want to basically return a multi-value string that describes each gather food invocation as follows. How are you going to determine if food is gathered or not? How do you know which ant is a worker ant and which ant is not a worker ant? With the worker ID. Because if it's not a worker ID, if it's not a worker ant, the ID is -1, which means it's not going to gather food. So an easy way for us to look at it. So I'm going to start off with our class definitions. We know this is going to be our C ant. And then we're just quickly going to code out our C ant. Hey. Because my typing brain is not here today. Right. And then we've got our methods. So we've got private underscore worker or worker ID. For wait. And we've got our iRecord. Yeah, is that all we need? Is there anything missing there? If there is, tell me what is missing. I'm typing. Yes, that's someone's sword. No, this doesn't want me to do without the read only, I guess. Okay, worker ID as integer. What I'm okay, so let's go and add that. So we've got our shared private instance variable, and we've got our starting value here of 99. So it's 99 because the worker ID must be still. That is true, but it's also starting with 19 because the application told us it needs to start at 99. So it tells us over here the integer value starts at 99, but up here it tells us that they are identified by values 100 and greater. So there's two ways of identifying the ant, but because every other ant is less than 0 or is -1, we can either check for -1 or we can check for values that are above 100. Well, values that are 100 and greater, 100 included. So there's two ways that we can check whether it's a worker ant or not. Okay, so let's just get our get function here. So we only have 30 minutes left, and considering how we typed our program last week, that might not be enough to get all of this done. Right. Then property. Would it not be nice if I could just auto allocate all of this for myself? Why play life on hard? Okay, we return our I'm missing weight. I blame lockdown. I don't want to think of weight. I'm trying to consider how much I've picked up. Right. And so we've already discussed the fact that we've got a shared instance variable here, but the application told us that it is not, it cannot be read nor changed directly. So no property method for underscore ID. Now for our functions. So wait, I'm missing something. I did not do the constructor. That is no bueno. We need our worker ant. So worker ID. Then we've got our weight integer as well, and we've got our not worker level as integer. Now, for our property method, because we have the constructors, sorry, not property method, for our next constructor, we just have our weight normal language. We have our worker ID that is set to -1. We've got our weight that will be equal to our weight, and our hot worker ID our hard worker level that will be equal to 0. Right, so that is our constructors done. And let's do our methods. So we've got 2 methods, 3 methods. We've got our determined work ethic, we've got our gather food, and we've got next get next ID. So what do we do when we do these 3 methods? If you look at our determined work ethic method, what do we do there? How do we determine that? I'm not displaying this, am I? Okay, there we go. How do we determine that? Returns and hard worker level divided by a random value between 1 and 10. So let's go and do that. We go private function. Wait, we said we're going to make it public. We go public function determine work ethic integer. We start with our randomize. So for those that did not attend this morning's lecture, there is a built-in function, a math function called random, RDM. So before you call that specific function, you need to invoke randomize. What this does, essentially, it ensures that you don't get the same value over and over. So if you don't call this, it will give you the same random function or same random value every time you run the program, which means it's not random at all. Randomize just uses different information to try and get a true pseudo-random value, which means it is really an unpredictable value. Now, unfortunately, it's not true pseudo-random. If you understand the algorithm, you can actually predict what the value would be, but let's not go into too much detail there. Then we create an object of our random. From our math function, and then we call a new random. Now, don't let this confuse you. We will do a dedicated slide on the random function to explain to you exactly what's going on here. We just found out this morning that you did not do random function in your first semester. All right. So how you work with random is essentially you call random and you give it a value, a lower bound and an upper bound value, which means that you've got a minimum value, which needs to be an integer, and a maximum value, which is also an integer. So that's the minimum you expect. That's the maximum value we expect. Now, you can look at the other methods out there as well. So you've got a random.next with no brackets returns a non-negative random integer that's generally between 0 and 1. Then you've got a random next returns a non-negative random integer that is less than the specified maximum. So you've got anything from 0 until that maximum, and then you've got a minimum value and a maximum value, which will include the lower and the upper bound values given. So the lower bound and the upper bound. And that will give you your random value, which you just simply return divided by your random value. Okay. What am I doing wrong here? I am converting. All right. So as requested, we return an ants hard work of level divided by the number value between 1 and 10, which means it is going to give us whatever the level is divided by that value. What is 0 divided by anything? 0 divided by any number, what's the result going to be? 0. That is correct. So then we have gather food. So gather food returns the amount of food units gathered by the ant. Ants are able to carry 7 times their weight. The amount of food they gather is determined by how much they can carry, multiplied by their work ethic. So make this public. Function gather food, and I return in units, so that would be integer. And our return essentially yes, you can put the return in the formula in the return, so it's going to calculate that value first, and then it's going to return that value. If you're uncomfortable with that, if that makes you uncomfortable, you can go and make a, let's say, return you can do that if you want to, and just simply return that value. There's nothing wrong with doing that, but you can return the calculation result from the calculation directly. You don't have to put it inside a temporary variable. As you can see, it just fills up space there. But that's only if your formulas, your variables, has already been determined. If there's still things you need to determine, then I would rather put it in a step-by-step algorithm than doing it in a one-liner. Okay, so gather food returns the amount of food units gathered by the ant. So that is, ants are able to carry 7 times their weight. The amount of food they gather is determined by how much they can carry, multiplied by their work ethic. So let's do a temp variable here. And say temp equals, so they can carry 7 times their own weight. The temp equals weight times 7, and that is multiplied by their work ethic, and then that is the value up here to give you a value, and that is the value you want to return. Everybody happy with that? Okay. Then the last function here is going to be, let's see, we have one more function. The last function is our shared get next ID. So this is now the value we want to get in order to increase our ID in our next variable. Am I now? Right. So you've got share. Get to the question now. I heard there was a question. Your mic is also unmuted, so you can also talk if you want to. Should probably have started with that. Get next. Okay. This is as integer. And here we increase our ID by 1. And we return this ID. Okay. Now we can do both ways. What was that now? Is that I'm assuming you're referring to the return. You can either use a temporary variable or you can just return the formula itself. So essentially, over here, I could have just put return in front of there and just return that. I'm assuming that is what you're referring to with both ways there. Now, I want to bring you back to our determination here. Determined work ethic is only used by a function inside the class. So can you see that this class invokes determined work ethic? This is the class that determines it. This is the class that returns that value for you. Can you see that? All right. So over here, if you change that to private, it doesn't change the operation of this class at all. It doesn't change how this program will function at all. But if I change gather food to private, will that change the outcomes of my program? If I change gather food to a private function, will that change how my program works? Why? Why will it change how my program works? Not at the moment, but because of how we defined everything and what you know of the program, why will it change how my program works? Who can tell me? Just want to move this to the side. You won't see it. No, but it's going to change how my program works. Because we need to use gather food in the colony class. That is correct. Because we've already indicated that we need to use it in another class. If it is private, you can't use it outside the class, which means it cannot be used. So if gather food becomes oh come on. If gather food becomes private, it can't be called from the colony class anymore. I'm just gonna get these. Let's use our design. We created it, so let's use that instead. Right. So we've got our instance variables. Let's do our colony name. Now, what was our limitation here once again? Because I see we didn't add it up here. Colony name is supposed to be a read-only value. Because once it's been set, you don't want it to be changed. Sting. Time to get stinged. I'm not talking, I'm not saying a lot here, but the property methods, I'm assuming you are all comfortable with property methods by now. So I'm not saying a lot while quickly typing these out. But while we do this, you guys tell me, last week's bonus question, how many of you tried it? Or the bonus attempt, how many of you tried it? Anyone? Tell me what the answer is. Why are you guys so quiet tonight? Is this tut confusing you? Am I confusing you? Or is the tut confusing you? It is a lot, yeah. We're just gonna code out these definitions, and then we'll probably have to call it night actually, because it's already 6:30. What time does this session end? We're gonna finish these first. So we still have about 15 minutes left. So let's quickly. Okay. Not get too sloppy here. I'll get you a question in a second. I'll get to that in a moment. Because I'm in a rush, I'm now going to make even more mistakes. That is how it generally works. C ant says array. We've got return C ant. C colony is the name of the class, not the instance variable. So why property colony? Oh, okay. You're addressing that. Okay. Just want to see. Oh. C. Small things. Small things. Okay, let's see what we have left. We've got work hours. Sorry. If I make a mistake now, I will correct it. Let's get to a spot where we can quickly talk. Rushing. Okay. So we've got all our property methods set. We've got our colony at the top, which is a read only, because we only want to read that. We don't want to change the colony name after it's been set. We've got all the other instance variables and our getters and our setters. The next thing we need to do is create our constructor. So we go public. I completely lost my mind now. Public sub new, and then this new would be the colony itself. So we've got colony name, this, that's acceptable, but the first one will not be. Okay. And then from here, we need to set our values, or do we? What are we doing inside our constructor? What do we need to do inside our constructor? So new, and we've got our function calls, sets the colony name, number of ants in the colony, the number of days ants has been operating, as well as the number of work hours that the ants work for each day. All cAnts objects must be instantiated within this constructor using the generate ant function. Okay. So we need to set our values. So in this case, we've got our colony name, which will now be set to colony. I can't do this. We've got a function called colony. We've got our number of ants, is now set to num ants. We've got our number of days. Number of days. There's an operation. That's our instantiation value. We've got, it's just the number of days the colony ant has been in operation. So that's the days in operation. We've got our hours work. We have our work hours. And then from there, hours worked for each day. All cAnt objects must be instantiated within this constructor using the generator ant. So we're going to have to generate ants here. But now, how many ants are we generating? So we've got our number of ants. So we know our, let's see, ants to be written to our number of ants. Okay, and then we need to instantiate all of our ants. So we've got our generate ant, which is a function. Because I'm in a hurry that I'm making so many mistakes. Okay. So quickly add our blank definitions here so that we can just do that. So we've got our first function, which is private generate ant. we've got our second function, which would be private function generate weight. We've got our private hard worker level. Integer. And we've got, let's see, we've got weight, hard worker level, worker and generate counts. Change fonts. But isn't this supposed to be a Boolean output? Just see. So generate worker chance returns a Boolean value of true if a randomly generated value between 1 and 100 is divisible by 10, otherwise return false. This is supposed to be Boolean. So now here is an example. Just notice that I made a mistake. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to go back to my design and fix that value. So it might still say integer there, but in my program, I realize now that it needs to be a Boolean, which means it's already different from my design. So it's okay to keep it like that. It's not ideal, but it's okay. Okay, then we've got our two public functions. Public function crack whip. Returns a string. And then we've got our public function together, which is also a string return. Now, if we look at the requirements for each one of these, if you simply look at the generate weight, it's a random function between 1 and 15. So generate weight will return a value between 1 and 15. That's just another random function inside here. Generate hard worker level returns a random integer value to determine how hard a CAND object should work. So if it's CAND for details, if you generate worker chance, which gives us if it's divisible by 10. So what you can do is you generate a random value between 1 and 100. You mod it by 10, and if the remainder is 0, you output true. If the remainder is anything other than 0, you output false. And then you've got your AND generator, and your AND generator will call each one of these. So randomly generate and return a CAND object. New CAND objects have a 1 in 10 chance that it is not a worker ant. If it is decided that the CAND object should be a worker ant, it must obtain a worker ID, otherwise the worker ID must be null value. Make sure of the above three generated functions to make use of the above three generated functions to automatically generate values for the instantiation of the CAND. So the first thing you would do is you would invoke the generate worker chance. If this returns a true, you will then invoke the other three options where you would generate the weight for the ant, you'll generate the hard worker level for the ant, and you will generate a worker ID, which you'll just call the next cint. Sorry, not the next cint, but the next record ID. The shared function that we created, the next ID, you'd call that to generate a new ID for the current ant. And if it returns false, you'll just call generate weight and the others will, remain empty, because the only thing your constructor needs is just the weight if it's not a worker ant. Then after that, you would do your crack whip, which for each function, so you'll use a for loop. For each one of the ants, you'll call the gather food, so it will be for each ant. Then you would go ant dot, let's say ant brackets ID dot gather food. The food value return will either be a 0 value. So what you can do is you can either first check whether the return is 0 and then determine that it's not a worker ant, or you can first check whether it is a worker ant by checking the worker ID, which would be -1. And if it's not a worker ant, add the ant is not a worker ant and does nothing to your string. Otherwise, you can then call your gather food, which will return the value, and then build your string as described. And that's for each one of your ants. So that is for the number of ants that that has been given to you. So once that has been invoked, it returns this multi-value string. So this is the output. It will be in number of ants long, with each line having its own description of whether an ant is not a worker ant or whether an ant is a worker ant with its ID and the value it returned to the food source. But here's the catch. Either inside this for loop, you need to return that value. You need to return that value of gather food to your underscore food reserves, or you create a void function inside this where you call that function, it invokes gather resources, and then you simply take that value in order to change your food resources. Personally, for me, I would just do it in CrackWhip. I wouldn't do a void function for gather food to call gather food inside the ant colony itself. And then gather simply just outputs these values for you. So it's just basically formatting your output to be colony name, the name of the colony, number of ants, the number of the ants, the hours worked, and the hours worked, the days in operations, the value, gather effort, display of crack whip method, which means you return your crack whip value in here, which is a multi-value, a multi-string value, and then your food reserves, that you output the food reserves here. And then on your main form, the last thing that remains on your main form, you'll determine which colony has the most food, so the highest food reserve level, and that is essentially the colony that the grasshopper will go to. Now, sorry for not coding them out fully. The purpose of tonight was simply to show you the composition, so that you can see how that composition will work essentially, and then the utility methods that we used inside. But I do recommend you, for practice, if you're done with your practical for Friday, go and code this one out. It's a nice practical. It's an interesting practical. I've given you all the information that is needed, but the thing you can go and practice is this multi-line output, especially over here for CrackWhip, the multi-line output that you need. Go and practice that. If you get stuck, I'm more than happy to help you with that. You can just put it inside the TUT questions and I will help you there. Otherwise, you can email it to me and Mr. Cottrell, or you can email it to me. I'll most likely give you the answers. Well, guide you with the answers. But it's good practice. The more you practice, the better you will do. Guaranteed. I can promise you that. If you keep on practicing, you'll do better and better every single time, and it will be easier. You'll get faster with everything as it goes along. Yeah. Are there any questions? I think I missed a question. Let's just see. Wouldn't then we be penalized under class, feel, and look for doing so, making your code different from the design? That is a valid point. So, in our situation, it is a design. Design is included to be a rough work. If there's one or two differences, let's say you use 2 global variables, and in your program you realize you need 3 global variables. That's fine. One missing is not an issue. As long as everything you need is there. If you're missing a global variable, they'll subtract them off. If you're missing a function, a method, they'll subtract them off. If you decided to split methods into more than one, that is okay. When we made integer in design and in code, we changed into Boolean when coding. So if the assistant asks you, why is it integer here and Boolean? Why is it integer in your design and Boolean in your code? Then you just simply explain to them that when you coded the function out, you realized that your design used the incorrect method and that you had to use a Boolean to display that. As long as you can state why it changed and where it changed, it doesn't matter, because your design is a guideline. Your design is not, it has to be 100% like this design. It's simply a guideline of how you're going to approach the program. And if an assistant gives you an issue about that, just come back to me, because then I'll look at it. But keep in mind that if your guideline is completely different than your code, then it is wrong. But if it's one or two things that you can state that, okay, once I developed the application or implemented the application, I saw that I needed to correct this. Now, the easiest, go and correct your design, but let's face it, most of you are lazy and probably will forget to do it in any case. So definitely correct it if you can, go back and correct it. But if you don't, if it's something small, it doesn't matter. As long as the idea is correct. If the idea is wrong, then it's just wrong. All right. Are there any other questions? Yes, it is bad coding practice to code before design. Now, here is one thing I can tell you. You guys won't actually see that speech. So I've got we deal yes. We deal with a lot of our students that go into industry that come back to us and give us feedback on what they experience. And one of the top students, I think last year or 2 years ago, last year and 2 years ago, she was top student a few years in a row. Came back to me and told me that she never realized how important a design is or was until she got to industry. Now, when she gets a project, the first thing she does before anything else, she does a design. Even if there's already a design, she would rather go and review the design and fix what is wrong before implementing the design or the project. Because if your design is wrong, your project already starts on the wrong foot. And it might not seem that big of a deal right now because it's small projects. But once you get to 30, your project tends to be a large project. It's a project that's going to take you a few months to complete. So there's a lot of things to consider, and you can't just sit and consider everything, because let's say you forget one small thing in an application that's about sorry, let's say you forget one small thing in a program that's about 10,000 lines long. If that one concept ties into multiple functions, it means you have to go and change or potentially re-implement multiple functions. I think what I'll do is I'll give you a proper demonstration of the importance of a design, let's say next week, Thursday, because there's actually a formula to calculate errors in a project, and that the error calculation starts in the design phase already. I'll just go and get that calculation for you. All right, so I'm going to stop the recording here. I'm just going to finish off with, if you have any questions, please do pop it into the Discord public chats. If you're going to DM us, rather email me, because I don't check my DMs on Discord. The Discord I'm using for your channels, I don't check the DMs there. I only check the public channels, and I check my emails. Well, you can see them continuously popping up while lecturing. So if you have any questions, please email us. I promise you it will be a faster response, or pop it into Discord into the correct text channel, because then everybody can see it. And I can promise you, if you have a question, there will be at least 2 to 10 other students that have the exact same question. Do these honor students who code have so much to code for exams? How many hours are they given? All right, so let me stop the recording first, then we can actually continue with this. All right, so for those, if you still have any questions regarding the TUT, please, you can pop them in Discord, you can email me. If you're going to do this application, you want to see if your implementation is correct, you can email your implementation to me as well, and I'll gladly review it for you. But other than that, I'll see you guys on Thursday.